Hello and welcome from the Faculty of Education at Monash University in Melbourne. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm Dean of the Faculty. I would like to acknowledge the lands over which we all meet today and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. As a migrant to these lands, that's important for me to say. Specifically, I'd like to acknowledge that the communities of the Kulin Nation are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands, and we pay our respects to their elders and to their past, present and future communities through our research, teaching and learning. So a very warm welcome to the first in our series of Global Critical Conversations, and to everyone who is live streaming the event on YouTube. Drawing on leading international experts, as well as our local partners here in Victoria, and of course our own Monash education researchers, we want these conversations to stimulate a global dialogue about issues of critical importance to education professionals, as well as the wider public, now during the global pandemic, but also well into the future. And we've timed the series to try to maximise local, national, Asia-Pacific and global participation, and each of these events will include opportunities for questions and discussions with the panels. It's great to see so many of you registered to live stream from all the way around the world, as well as requesting access to the recordings that will be available a few days after each event. The Global Critical Conversation series comes out of our faculty's ambitious research agenda, with its overarching theme of fostering fair and sustainable futures. There are also 5 sub-themes that integrate our faculty's research strengths, bringing together researchers from education, counselling and psychology. These sub-themes are reimagining educational leadership, transforming teaching and learning, shaping digital futures, enhancing health and well-being, and educating for diversity and inclusion. Each conversation in the series will speak to one or more of these research priorities. And for this first conversation, our question is, can educational inclusion, equity and excellence coexist? Please do join in the discussion in the YouTube comments section. You'll need to be logged into YouTube to do that, but it will mean that you can really join in the discussion. And we also encourage you to comment along on Twitter, following our account at Monash Education and using the various hashtags. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Virginia Trioli, Australian journalist, author and broadcaster, and our facilitator for this Global Critical Conversation series.
Inclusion, equity and excellence coexist, and we've got a terrific panel to speak to you about this today. I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. Welcome to all of our live streamers wherever you are. Just a quick call of the board according to our Slido poll here of where you're streaming us from. We've got people from the Central Coast in New South Wales, Sydney, Bendigo, Indonesia, Italy, Queensland, India, Rebecca from Singapore, hello Rebecca from Singapore, South Africa and many other places besides. I hope you've logged on to Slido. I know you've got all the details of how to get onto that there. That's where you can post your questions throughout our conversations and during our presentations, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can when we get to our discussion and Q&A at the end of our sessions and at the end of our presentations. You can go into your YouTube comments chat. You need to be logged into YouTube in order to do this, and log any of your questions there in YouTube, and we'll get to them, as I mentioned, and try and include them. We'd love you to get out on social media as well, and spread the word about the Critical Conversation series that Monash University is having, and also to engage other people in our conversation today. I'll keep using today because it's tonight, evening and morning, wherever you might be around the world. Maybe now might work well as well. And in order to get on social media, please tag in Monash, and that's at Monash Education. And the hashtags you can use for our conversation today: hashtag Global Critical Conversations, also hashtag World Teachers Day, and hashtag Research in Action, because that's part of what we're celebrating at the moment as well. World Teachers Day and National Children's Week, which is why our focus today is on educational inclusion. It's interesting to note that sometimes differences are used as a justification for excluding learners, but international research has suggested that responding to diversity is the pathway to bringing about improvements that actually benefit all students. So with that, let me introduce our panelists to you, and then we'll start our conversation from there. So, and I think we can start to see them as I call them up. Anna Laktionova is a leading teacher at Keysborough College. Give us a wave, there's Anna. A co-lecturer in inclusive education at Monash University. She's been in the teaching profession for more than 7 years, and Anna performed educational leadership roles, demonstrating excellent experience in leading teams, student management, and curriculum development as well. Anna, great to have you as part of the discussion today. John Baston joins you as well. John Baston is the principal of Keysborough College, a Victorian government secondary school in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, a position he's held for 6 years. He's been in the teaching profession for more than 35 years, and in his career, he's worked in a number of schools, both metropolitan and regional. John, great to have you here. Thanks so much. Kiki Meshu is Professor of Education at the University of Southampton in the UK. Currently, she's Director of Research, Deputy Head of Southampton Educational School. Internationally known for her research in the field of inclusive education, her work focuses on children's and young people's voices as a means of understanding notions of marginalisation and developing inclusive practices in schools. Kiki, good to see you there. Mel Ainscough is with you as well. Mel Ainscough is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Manchester, Professor of Education at the University of Glasgow, and Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. Mel is, in recent years, his research has had a significant impact on the global efforts of UNESCO to promote inclusion and equity in education. Mel, I don't know if I can see you live. I wonder if someone can turn your video on just so we can see you, or if you can turn it on yourself. See if we can get that going soon, just so we can see everyone live as we're talking.
Hi.
Hi, we just can't see you, Mel. I don't know if you've got your video disabled. Maybe give that a go. Mel Ainscough, thanks, Mel. There you go. And here's Umesh. Umesh Sharma is Professor in the Faculty of Education at Monash University here in Australia, where he's the academic head of the Educational Psychology and Inclusive Education community. Umesh's research programs in the area of disability and inclusive education span a wide variety of countries. Umesh, great to see you there as well. Hello. And finally, Chris Follen, a professor and an international education consultant specialising in supporting governments and school systems to implement effective and quality inclusive education. She's worked in the field of education for more than 40 years as a teacher, university lecturer, and government advisor. And Chris, welcome to you too. There you are. Please, wherever you are, virtually welcome our esteemed panel. It's great to have everyone here. All right, well, we've got 3 key questions that we want to get a strong response to from all of our panellists. We're going to go through them sequentially. Keep loading up your questions on our YouTube comments chat field there, and we'll try and get to them later on. After those 3 questions, that's where we'll have our broader chat. But our first question is, why is a concern with inclusion and equity critical in creating excellent education systems? And we're going to start with Professor Mel Ainscough from the University of Manchester. Mel, I'll get you to kick off.
Okay, well, good morning to everybody where you are in the world. The sun has just come up here in England, so we're at the beginning of our day. I think this conversation could not be more timely, really, as we all around the world struggle with the impacts of this terrible pandemic. And whatever else it's done, it's thrown further light on a problem that was already there. The way in which education systems do very well for some children, but leave some children behind, and indeed leave some children out. So I'm going to argue that the focus on inclusion and equity is the way to excellence. It's not, can they coexist? That's the wrong statement for me, or the wrong question. My argument is it's the way to achieve excellence in education. And I want to argue that for two reasons. First of all, it's a question of logic. What do you mean by excellence? This is a value question. I'm quite clear, I think, what I mean. An excellent education system is an education system that does well for all children. So that's the goal, to create education systems that do well for all children. In our UNESCO work recently, the mantra we've used is every learner matters and matters equally. So for me, that's the way forward. We have to work on the agenda of inclusion and equity. So therefore, we have to have a clear understanding of what we mean by inclusion and equity. And of course, these are competed ideas. People have different ideas. When I work with governments and other policymakers, and I sometimes do, I say to them, don't have a policy for inclusion. Don't have a policy for equity. If you do, it becomes somebody's job. Somebody else looks after it. Inclusion and equity are principles that should inform all policy, the curriculum, teacher education, the assessment systems, the budgets, and so on. So they're principles that should inform all aspects of an education system. So the logic of that, of course, is that what we're here talking about today is a transformative agenda. It's not doing something on the margins to the education system. It's asking questions about how the education works, and particularly asking questions about what are the barriers that some of our children experience. And barriers can take many forms. They can be physical barriers, which are usually easy to overcome. They can be barriers to do with policy. The curriculum can be a barrier. The assessment system can be a barrier. It could be to do with the way the school organizes itself. That can create barriers. But perhaps the most difficult barriers are those that are in our minds, the limitations of our expectation of what is possible. If we don't believe that some children can participate, if we don't believe that some children can be included in everything, then of course it's not likely to happen. So for me, that's the key argument. Inclusion and equity as the way to achieving excellence. Now, there's another empirical set of responses to my argument as well, which I'll briefly mention, but they're in the handouts that have been sent to you. And that is, if we look around the world, the best education systems, as judged by all sorts of measures, are systems which focus on every child. They don't sacrifice some children in order to benefit others. I'm thinking, for example, of places like Finland, parts of Canada, Singapore is sometimes mentioned, South Korea. These education systems, whatever they do, and they work in different ways, they focus on the progress of every child. We also know that there are some countries that have made enormous progress in relation to all this in terms of it being every child. Again, in the handouts that I've connected you to, I mentioned, for example, Italy and Portugal, where virtually every child is in the mainstream school, in the mainstream classroom. So we know it's possible. So for me then, inclusion is a process. It's a journey. Every school is inclusive of some children. The next question is, how do we reach out and include all children? How do we develop our capacity to reach the children we're not reaching at the moment? So the logic of that is to say, what we're here talking about today is really about school improvement. It's about the improvement of the education system, and specifically the improvement of schools. What I'm suggesting is it's school improvement with attitude. It's not any old school improvement. It's certainly not school improvement as judged by test results. It's school improvement which is judged in relation to the mantra that I put before you. Every learner matters. Every learner matters equally. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Mel, thanks so much. Umesh Sharma from Monash Education will move to you next, and then we'll pick up some of the ideas that have been raised there by Mel and by you, and we'll discuss it amongst us as a panel. Umesh. You're still muted, Umesh.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you very much, Mel. Good evening. First of all, I must like to share very good news. I'm calling from Melbourne, and today we had 0 COVID-19 cases. So we are celebrating it in Melbourne. I must say this is a very, I mean, as you know, Mel talked about it, this is something that's connected everyone in the world right now, COVID-19. And we are talking about education, we are talking about inclusion, we are talking about excellence. I want to share my story. I came into this field as a special educator. And when you teach in a special school, you know, when people talk about inclusion, you always get worried. I say, how do you make inclusion happen for this child who has, you know, severe learning needs, and, you know, start thinking about it. So that's how I came into this field, and I always was very skeptical about inclusion. And, you know, this idea, then I started thinking about how do you make it happen? So there are some important ideas that have come into this field. You know, when we talk about inclusion, the most important thing is people think, okay, we'll teach, then we do inclusion, and then we have kids with disabilities. That's how they think. But now what I have realized, actually, inclusion is a way for excellence. And what you need to think about, you need to think about all kids in our classrooms, in our school system. Inclusion is making sure that when we teach, all kids in our classroom are getting the best education system possible for them. Sometimes we feel like, you know, when you start teaching, well, if you want to do inclusion, sometimes they say, well, how will I include a child in my classroom? I don't want to do it, it's too much work for me. What I want to say is, if you really want to do inclusion, first you need to fix the education system for students who are already in our classrooms. And, you know, people talk about inclusion before thinking about how we will do it, and we forget inclusion cannot happen if we start fixing our classroom, the kids who are already in our system. But inclusion also requires for us to rethink how we conceptualize inclusion. It requires us to say, if you really want to do inclusion, you need to bring in, you need to start thinking about how are we going to support our educators. It's inclusion is not just about students, it's also about the educators in our system. How are we going to support them when we start implementing it? And then also it's about how the system is going to support educators, how the system is going to support the school system. So all those things need to go in this journey to become excellent. So if I think about in the past, it used to be inclusion, education, and then, you know, we say, can we do excellence as well? For me, if you want to do excellence, inclusion needs to be the foundation to make it happen. So it should be the starting point. And then you start talking about how are we going to support all learners. And for me, inclusion is an opportunity for teachers. So what I mean is, think about if you are a driver, sometimes when you learn to drive on roads where there is no traffic, it's quite easy for you to do. But if you really want to become a good driver, think about if there is a lot of traffic on our roads, you become a better driver on those roads. So for teachers, it's an opportunity. When you learn to drive on those difficult roads, when you have lots of difficulties, it makes you a better driver. So for me, inclusion is an opportunity for schools, for educators, and for the system. And as Mel talked about, if you can't do inclusion, actually you can't achieve excellence in our system. So I also look forward to have more questions and more ideas from the rest of the panel members.
Umesh, thanks so much. Mel, can I just quickly come back to you, and then we'll throw it open to the panel as well. And as I mentioned to all our panelists at the beginning of this, you know, it'd be great to have them jumping in as they see fit, but you'll need to make sure that you're unmuted when you do. Talk to me about whether the concept of the way to excellence is actually through inclusion. How you have overcome, or how you've seen people overcome the initial resistance to that idea, because we know that resistance is a key issue within many different schools and also within school bodies as well. What's the argument that jumps over the initial resistance to that concept?
Well, I think it goes back to my use of the metaphor of the journey, really. You're not going to take everybody with you from the first day. So, of course, the issue of management and leadership, which I'm sure our colleagues from the school will talk about later, is absolutely crucial. It's a social process. It's bringing people together, teachers, of course, and support staff, but as Kiki will talk about later, also potentially including children themselves, then going beyond the school gate, involving the community and especially, of course, families. Schools that make progress, and there are many that have, and I've seen some very good examples during my work in Queensland, for example, in Australia. Schools that make progress bring people together and have a debate about what do we mean by inclusion, what do we mean by equity, and how do we support one another. So it's a social process of development, and of course it takes time. It's not, you know, Umesh has just used the term doing inclusion.
Yes.
I know it's just a use of language, but you don't do inclusion, you believe it. It's something that is a passion that informs everything. And that's why, and I keep saying, it takes time, but we can be optimistic because there are many examples all around the world, in the richest countries and in the poorest countries, of when people want to achieve education for all, it can be done.
I wanted to turn to you, Anna, because we have Anna and John here, John Baston and Anna Laksianova, who are, you know, the classroom practitioners. Anna, what did you hear in those opening statements that resonated with you?
Well, I would say that I agree with what was mentioned by Mel and Umesh, and I think it's a great point is theme is inclusion for teachers, and school leadership is an opportunity to grow and opportunity to get to know your students and get to know your community. So I think it's and also it needs to be teachers and educators need to believe in it. You can't really sort of force people to believe in inclusion. But I think the more you get to experience it and get to see the effects in your classroom, the easier it is to spread in the school and in the community.
It'll be good to talk about that a little bit later, about the effects that you do see in your classroom, and I know we'll get to that when we hear from you. John, can I turn to you, because Umesh was talking about how to conceptualise inclusion. Talk to me about that practically.
I think just to begin with, I'll just pick up on a point of Mel's around policy. We are mandated to have many policies around inclusion and equity and diversity. But one thing you do have to be careful is that sometimes when you create policies that are very tight, they actually silo the responsibility, and it makes it actually easier for other people to avoid having to have anything to do with it. So it's really about ingraining it as a culture throughout the school.
That's Mel's observation about doing inclusion, rather than actually being sort of an integrated ethos.
Yeah. Now, sorry, what was the second part with Umesh?
Oh, it was how to conceptualise it.
I think probably one of the most important things, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when I'm talking, is just making sure that, I mean, there are so many different definitions of terms such as inclusiveness, equity, and excellence, that you need to start with a common, clear vision and understanding, and that's how you conceptualise it within your school. If you don't begin with that, you have 100 different parallel ideas of what should be happening.
And you would have to bring people with you in conceptualising that as well. That can't be a top-down directive.
I think that the important part of it is that it is ingrained as culture of the school. So when people come into the school, they see it all around them. It's not just something they can actually not be aware of.
Mm. Were there any particular issues that you picked up when Mel was speaking there, John, that you wanted to respond to?
I think really just that one about the policy at this stage is the strongest one. There are a couple of other bits and pieces, but I'll only repeat myself when I get to what I'm going to say.
Chris, can I turn to you? You've been in this field for a very, very long time. Anything you want to initially pick up on?
Well, I absolutely love Mel's school improvement with attitude saying. I think I'm going to use that one. It's rather lovely. I've done a lot of work around Asia, and one of the biggest issues there are the embedded beliefs and cultures of the communities in which you're working. And before you can actually start to move forward with inclusion, you have to address those cultures which have been there for thousands of years, and the expectation of what the people believe. So you've sort of got to undo a cultural bias first before you can start implementing a new one. I also wanted to pick up one other thing, Mel. You talked about we don't do inclusion, and you're right, it's a process. I've come across many participants in workshops that we've been running, and they've said, oh, okay, well, we've got a 10-point checklist. Let me check it off. We've done inclusion. Now we can move on to something else. It's not like that. It's an ongoing process. Inclusion is part of the transformation of what's happening in a school. And as Mel says, this is an ongoing, it's a social process. And the more we talk about it, the more we engage with everybody else in the school, the easier it is, as Anna said, the easier it is to implement, and the more successful it is.
Kiki, can I turn to you, Kiki Mishu? Anything initially you'd like to put on the table before we move on?
Yes, I mean, everybody has raised very important issues. Just from my part, I mean, I will speak about children's voices in a while, but for this introductory part, I think hearing all the others talking about the importance of beliefs and development of inclusive cultures, one area that sometimes I notice might be forgotten, it's our own individual actions and ways of behaving and the message that those reflect within it. So sometimes people are saying we are going to be inclusive and this is what the policy is saying and we're going to try our best, but without reflecting on small day-to-day behaviors that might not communicate the same messages. And that's very important, especially when you work with children and young people. So the kind of cultures and behaviors and messages we give are very important for creating inclusive schools and inclusive communities.
I want to just get down, before we move on, just down to the syntax of it, this particular question. And Mel, we'll go back to you, and then if we can maybe even quickly go around the panel. What is it about inclusion? What's the fundamental thing and inherent nature of both the concept and the lived reality of inclusion that creates excellence? What's the link?
Well, some of people who participation will be aware of a thing called the Index for Inclusion that we developed in England in the late 90s and then came to be used internationally. And in the Index for Inclusion, we had a triangle of interconnected issues. And we said to move a school forward towards a more inclusive, now equitable way of working, you have to look at three things. You have to look at the policies of the school, what the school says it does. Then you have to look at the practices of the school, what the school actually does. And they may not be the same. What a school says it does, believes it does, and what it actually does may be different. But then the third thing, as John has mentioned, and Chris has mentioned, and Kiki's mentioned, is what underplays all that, and that's the culture of the school. The beliefs, the values, and attitudes that are there in every school, which may be positive or negative towards particular groups of children. And that's why this is a kind of a deep process of growth over time, where we do look at the policies and try to articulate what we mean, but we also look at the practices. And that's why evidence is so crucial. I think this is going to come out of some of the later contributions, collecting evidence about what we do in the school, some of which will shock us and surprise us and make us think again. And then creating a debate, an ongoing debate, not an event, an ongoing debate about what do we believe in. And schools that make progress, in my experience, and I've worked with many of them really, over a long period, they rethink the beliefs that they work to. And they become kind of mantras in the school, and they guide the attitudes and the actions of people in the school, and they spread across the school community over time.
I'm just
one last thing.
Sure. No, but I just want to jump in and say, I don't know if it's you clicking your keyboard or if you are banging on your keyboard or something rattling, but there's a rattle there, and I think it might be you. So
it might be me. Yes, it might. Sorry, I'm getting excited. So over time, that kind of debate in a school is what brings about change. And that's why I have said already, the issue of management and leadership is crucial of this. Bringing people to have together to have that debate is what do we believe in? And how do we make sure that our actions reflect what we believe in? And that's what will lead to a school which is more effective for all children.
Before we move on to the next section, John, anything you wanted to add here? Because I could see you nodding vigorously.
Yeah, that comment, the thing that you said about what is it about inclusion that creates excellence?
Yes.
It's your definition of excellence is absolutely crucial to this.
I was going to ask you, do we need to define excellence here? Yes.
Because if you define excellence simply in terms of academic results, the majority of students will never achieve true excellence. It's about how you define that, so that, and then you build your system so that every student is able to achieve excellence in their eyes and in their family's eyes.
So how do you define it, John?
Excellence, that actually is one of our values here. It's about gaining satisfaction and increased sense of self-worth when they have a sense of achievement. It's about having high expectations. It's all around their own personal sense of achievement, around their academic, social, sporting or cultural goals. That's the definition of excellence here.
I'm happy to keep working and redefining and hearing more definitions of that from all of you as we go on. Let's move on to our second question, and that's how can teachers be supported in fostering inclusion and equity? What's interesting about this question to me is that it seems to imply that that's tricky, that there is support that's needed, that again, as I mentioned earlier to Mel, that there might be barriers or obstacles to that, or even outright negativity or hostility to it. So the question, how can teachers be supported in fostering inclusion and equity? And Professor Chris Forlem, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, I agree with you completely. It is tricky, but the perspective I'm going to take here is I'm going to look at the impact of teacher education from the perspective of developing equity and inclusive education. So I'm just going to raise a few points which I think will hopefully stimulate some good conversations. So regarding teacher education, what do we actually know? Well, we know that teacher quality is pivotal to effective inclusive education. We know that teachers have often very little input into decision making, yet they're the frontline people who have to implement policy. And in many of the less developed countries, this has to occur with poorly established infrastructure and support mechanisms. So what can we agree upon then? Well, I think we would all agree, everyone who's listening here, that inclusive education is complex and that it varies enormously between the country and the context. All of the UNESCO reports over the past 20 years have raised the importance of teacher education. There's been a rapid increase in classroom diversity and much greater accountability for teachers to be able to modify or differentiate the curriculum. So 3 points I want to put out here for our conversation today. The first one is the role of teacher educators in preparing our teachers for inclusion. A whole range of models have been implemented over the last couple of decades to improve teacher education in pre-service training. And I know that Kiki's going to talk about the school-based model, so I won't mention that. But in the early 2000s, there were a lot of separate courses brought into universities, but most of these were categorical, and they were often based on looking at disability rather than looking at inclusion of diversity. I've noticed, though, in recent years, there's been a dampening down of these courses. The hours have been reduced. There's been a much stronger focus now on what we call infused courses, where we're expecting the curriculum areas to take on board the issue of training teachers for diversity. Teacher education, though, has to deal with a very inflexible curricula, which is often planned years in advance. And more recently, there's been much increased lack of face-to-face time. I'm not just talking COVID. This has happened over a period of time. I understand at the moment it's much worse because of COVID. But students tend to enroll in what they call full-time courses, and yet the reality is a lack of commitment to full-time preparation. They're often working in order to pay their way through university, and they minimal part-time, and they still complain, of course, that everything is too theoretical. So the second point I want to raise is the provision of support. Mel's already talked about this and how important it is to provide support for teachers. Now, the first type of support that used to be provided in schools when schools started to say they were becoming inclusive was withdrawing students with special needs and giving them one-on-one teaching with a different teacher in a different class. And this has clearly moved in the other direction now, and we've now got much more in-class support. Most schools have developed something like a school-based team, which works at a whole school approach, and the implementation of mentors and localised district-wide services. So that whole issue of support, and Umesh has already said the issue of systemic support as well is very critical. And the third point I think we need to consider when we're looking at teacher education is resourcing. There's been a wide range of evidence-based practices that have been developed now. You look on the research, you'll find hundreds of different ideas, many of them based on good research. And these have been proven to support learners with diverse needs. These have been disseminated widely, according to the research, but when you actually look at it, rarely have been applied in regular classes. So why do teachers not use these research evidence-based practices? And they come up with a range of reasons. Often they lack confidence. Often there's insufficient training, so they don't exactly know how to implement them. They say they lack time to investigate them fully, and they're not supported. So in summary, these three key critical issues, and they're only just some of the issues related to teacher education, but if we want to ensure effective and equitable teacher preparation for inclusive education, we need to look at upskilling teacher educators and also look at reforming pre-service teacher training. We need to review support structures at all levels to make sure it's contextually appropriate and it meets the teacher's needs. It's not just something we're giving them. It's actually not what they want. And we need to improve ongoing school-based professional learning for using these evidence-based practices. If we want to get quality inclusive teachers, we need to provide better quality preparation and ongoing support. Open for conversation.
Chris, thank you. And we'll get to discuss it in a moment. Just a little note to all of you, if you're not muted, just to be careful with your papers and the like, just so there's not too much rattling and scratching near your microphone. We've got a lot of people tuning in today, so we'll try and keep it as clean as we can. Kiki Michoud, let's go to you from Southampton University.
Yes, so the perspective I want to bring to the table is the idea of engaging with children and young people's views, voices, as it has been described in the literature. And I'm using Mel Ensko's position, which my own work has been influenced by that position, that the biggest resource in any class is the children themselves. And I've argued in the past that if we see inclusion as a big puzzle, I argue that children themselves hold a big part of that puzzle, since they are the ones that are experiencing inclusive or exclusive practices in schools. So my latest work with colleagues around Europe is focusing on the idea of listening to children and young people's views in order to develop inclusive lessons, inclusive practices in schools. And in fact, we've moved a step further, not just listening to the views of children and young people, but teachers having dialogues with children and young people in order to understand process of inclusion and identify ways to address those barriers to learning and participation that we've mentioned before. So a group of us from Austria, Denmark, England, Portugal, and Spain work collaboratively with schools, so school-based approach, to take back to the point that Chris made earlier about quality professional development within schools. So we've developed an approach, inclusive inquiry, which focuses on those dialogues between teachers and children in order to promote inclusion. So the approach involves collaborative action research in schools, where teachers form trios in schools to focus on a particular lesson. Those three teachers could be from the same year group or from different year groups, and they choose 3 students from their classes that will become student researchers. Now, those 3 students are in some ways seen as hard to reach. And we are not just focusing on those that fall in predetermined categories, such as disabled, migrants, though those may be the ones chosen, but we are asking teachers to think about any child that may be seen as hard to reach at some point in their learning journey, and focus on those as well, such as those lacking in confidence or not being able to connect with them within the lesson. So the teachers choose 3 that will become researchers. Then they train them to be researchers, focusing on how those researchers will collect the views of their own classmates, as well as focusing on how they can observe lessons, focusing on what makes it difficult for some children to participate within the context, or what helps them for the lesson they're going to design. So then the 3 researchers go and collect the views of their classmates, and then they analyze that information, and they plan collaboratively with their teachers one lesson, taking into account the views of all students. So we are taking into account the views of every single learner to design a lesson. Then the lesson is taught by one teacher, whilst the other 2 teachers and the student researchers from other classes observe. And at the end of the lesson, They sit down together, they analyze, they identify implications and modifications that they need to make. And the process is repeated 3 times for refining the lesson with a focus on student engagement. So through this approach, they then identify implications for practice that they can implement throughout the school, throughout the classes that have taken part, taking into account the views of students. So the approach is very inclusive at various levels. And one of the things that we found is that teachers are really surprised by the issues that students are bringing to the table and the things that they notice. So they are surprised and they are prepared to make changes in order to develop more inclusive lessons. And we've seen a range of impacts through the use of the approach, such as developing closer relationships between students and teachers, making changes.
Let's see if we unfreeze here with Kiki. If we don't, we're coming to the end of Kiki's time speaking anyway, so we'll see if we can get her back. No, we might leave that there. I know Chantal's watching, and Chantal, you can sort out with Kiki if we need to get her logged back in. But I wanted to turn to you, if I could, Anna, because you're listening to us speak about what teachers need in order to be supported in fostering inclusion and equity. What do you need?
Well, a couple of things spoke really close to my heart. Time is one of the issues that I think teachers are always time poor. And I think that's just a general nature of our teaching profession. And I think that if we have, and just the ability to work with the students, have that time set aside to implement this project, evaluate, and something that Kiki mentioned sounds like a really great project to have with the students. And I think if this culture is embedded in the school culture, then I think it will be really easy to implement all the all the inclusive practices. And I just wanted to mention Umesh, because I know that he wanted to talk about the teacher education, and it is one of the projects that I was a part of. So I will just ask Umesh to talk about the preparation of future teacher educators.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
That's why they're paying me the big money to sit here in this chair. So we'll get to that, but I'm not finished with you, Anna. How? I mean, you said, you want to be, freed up to spend time with the student and the like. How exactly? How does that look like in the classroom, in your working day, in the school? How is that structured?
Okay, so recently in our school there is one new initiative that we have. It's called professional learning communities, or teams. And I think that's a great initiative in terms of the teachers coming together, evaluating their practice, setting up their research inquiry questions, and then throughout the year they can come together, they can get some evidence from the classrooms, and then they can unpack it. And we also have some professional help from the leadership team and also from external presenters. And I think it's just if you treat your teaching as a constant research project, I think it's the best way you can implement it. The inclusion in your practice, and as it was mentioned before, it is a process, so it requires time.
I'm glad you mentioned the leadership team, though. It seems to me that would be absolutely crucial. Umesh, we'll hear from you quickly on teacher education. We've covered a fair bit of that, but just briefly, because I actually would like to, before we move on to the next section, really talk about the leadership team. Umesh?
Thank you very much, Virginia. So what I believe, the point that all of them have touched about teacher education, I believe teacher education has not done its job really well internationally. And we know it from research, because, when teachers are coming out of universities, they're not fully prepared to implement inclusive practices. So what we know is, when you talk about all countries, whether you are Bangladesh or Fiji or Australia or India, we know that teachers need to believe in an idea before they start implementing an idea. So they need to have a heart, and then they need to have head, they need to know the skills, and then they practice the idea. So heart, head, and hands, they go side by side. So what we are learning is, if you really want teachers to implement inclusive practices, they need to believe that it's going to make me a better teacher. So what we need to do is say, if you are in different countries, let's say if you are in Fiji, what you need to do is connect with the cultural beliefs and practices of that country. So teachers need to believe like why it's good for my own society. We need to connect to some of the practices that they use in say Fiji. And they have like a practice like Talanoa, they sit in circle, they share stories. So that's how you start. And if you are talking about like India, you need to start talking about Gurukul system. They used to do it in the past. Start talking about those roots of your own system and bring that in teacher education. And then you'll see that teachers start connecting with the new knowledge. So they don't see it's a Western idea coming to their country. They need to see it's an idea that we had in our society and we can build upon those things. So then you can change their beliefs, their skills and their practices. And I kind of quickly touch on that, the idea that Anna was talking about. For us to practice inclusive skills, we need to either take schools, we either need to bring schools to universities or take universities to schools, but we need to work in partnership. We need to talking to each other and learning from each other. And that's how we can improve teacher education internationally.
John, let me turn to you before we move on to our next section, because we mentioned educational leadership there in passing in relation to how teachers can be supported in fostering inclusion and equity. What's your role?
My role basically is, to put it bluntly, is to decide where the dollars go. And it's because dollars support programs, dollars hire staff. And really what it is my decision about to set the strategic direction of the school. Now, as you can well imagine, in any school, there is a million different priorities that are there among the staff. It's about, my role is to identify the priorities of the school and provide the strategic direction that will maximise the student outcomes. Now, that's listening to people that work for me, listening to the research that they use as the basis for their evidence, and then as a leadership team, coming up with the direction about where we're going to be going. But also the very, very important part of it is making sure that everyone understands why we're going where we're going and why that direction will be of the most benefit to the students. Because that is our mantra here. How will it improve the learning outcomes of our students?
Well, that actually flows nicely into our final question before we get to our panel discussion, which is what are the implications for school organisation and leadership? And John, we'll kick off with you and then we'll hear from Anna.
Okay, I'll just set a bit of background for all our international people here today. I think I'm very fortunate in that the government system I work for has a very strong belief in inclusion and equity. Our state government, for many of its faults, has been a strong supporter of an education but have had a strong focus on education in the time that's been here. And they also give me a considerable amount of autonomy to be able to make decisions about directions within my school. But it is, of course, accountable for them as well. A little bit about my school, because it'll help you understand probably part of the reason why I'm here today. We've got just over 1,800 students here, ranging from about over 50 different nationalities, 75% coming from languages of a background other than English, and over 60% of them qualifying as English as an additional language students. So we have quite a diverse range. We also have a significant number of PSD students, program for students with disadvantage. So we do have quite a number of range of students with different abilities within our schools. Our school values are respect, excellence and diversity, which fits very nicely with what today is all about. And I told you about before how we define excellence. It's for those individual students. And for our value of diversity is around students valuing the differences between themselves and other members of the community. One of the things that is very strong in this school is that we expect our staff to display those values as well as the students. It's not just there for the students, those values are important for everyone. One of the things that from a leadership point of view is to make sure that there is that common understanding about what each of these terms mean. Because I honestly believe that everybody that comes into this school as a teacher or as a student their own experiences have flavoured their understanding of what words like inclusiveness, equity, excellent, respect, all of those words mean. And without sort of diminishing what their experiences were, I think it's important that that as people come into this school, they understand the meanings of those words within our culture. We talked about a little bit before, somebody said about not doing inclusiveness, having one-off events. They simply don't work in schools because people come and go. Every year I have a turnover of about 30 staff members, whether it be teachers or support staff. And what we have to do is induct those people into an understanding of what our culture is. And also every year we have probably about 400 to 500 new students come into the school as well. So it really is about making sure our culture is integrated into everything that we do. One of the things I'm very proud of is the fact that that probably by about the end of first term, about in the 3 to 4 months, every student in the school is able to tell me what our school values are, and not just simply recite them, but say why they're our school values as well.
John, you probably don't have very much longer, but if you'd like to wrap up this part.
Okay, just about two more things. It was touched on before by Kiki, which is about involving student voice in this. Student voice has become a large part of Victorian schools in recent years, about giving them an authentic voice. But just one thing that we realised when we had implemented it for a little while is that we actually had to take a step back and teach the students how to have a voice. Because in most cases, when teachers asked kids how they were doing, the kids would say straight away, yeah, no worries, sir, everything's great. We had to actually teach them how to give them that feedback and then make the teachers accountable for using that feedback and showing how they had used it.
I reckon Kiki's going to have something to say about that. I might just draw to a close there for the conversation. And let's move to you if we can on the implications for school organisation and leadership.
Okay, so I'm just briefly want to say that I'm a teacher. I teach Chinese, I teach humanities, English, and I'm also in charge of Year 8. And as a teacher, I think first you're thinking like, what is inclusion for me? And as a teacher, you think, what will my classroom look like? And I wanted to see that everyone feels happy, safe, and that they feel that they belong there and that they can achieve and grow. And based from that definition, as a beginning teacher, I tried to implement it in my classroom. And I came across a number of barriers along the way, but I will mention a couple of things that I found very important for me as a teacher on this journey. So first, a very important aspect is to have a predictable classroom with routines, rules, and structures in place that are fair and consistent. And so quite often, it's a big struggle for the teachers to stay consistent and to make sure that the rules and structures are fair, but it's worth it in the long run. And of course, sometimes it will be very difficult to implement it on the last period on Friday, but stay there. Next point is to focus on the process, progress, and effort, and do not disregard small improvements. So quite often we want to see grand results, and quite often we want to see academic excellence in our students. And I think it's something that is not necessarily the only thing that we can embrace in teaching. For example, for one student, it can be something that comes really easily. For another student, it might be like a marathon to achieve a very simple thing. I had a student who, for whom it was very difficult to stay in a chair for the period of the class, and it was a huge effort for him. And there was like a couple of things that he was not familiar with school routines, and he kept being discouraged, and no one acknowledged that he was trying. And he came to me and he was very upset. And he's like, well, miss, I'm trying, but no one notices. And I think it's very important for students to be acknowledged and to be noticed, even despite the amount of the effort, or despite the amount of the achievement that we are able to see. So just to notice their hard work. That brings me to the next point that had been mentioned before, is to know your student, but also be genuine. Invest your time in building these relationships, invest your time into getting to know your students, and sometimes having some laughs and spending 10-15 minutes of the lesson just on something not topic related. Building these relationships is a great investment in building this inclusive classroom and getting to know your students. A couple of things that I practice as a teacher was, well, first, you acknowledge all students when you start your class. So everyone feels that they are valued. And also a couple of activities that I practice is called circle times. And that's when you basically, it can be game-based, can be discussion-based, and when each student is heard. So yeah. I think that's a really great investment for the teachers and for building this inclusive and respectful environment. Another thing that I think is quite often dominates our profession is labeling and preconceived ideas. Quite often the students that either come with funding or with behavior challenges will be already labeled as a quite, will come with the baggage. And I think that each student deserves a fresh start, and they deserve to just have try and find different approaches. I would say that sometimes, even with some students, you need to have a number of fresh starts, and that's okay. We are all learning. We are all learning different ways how to interact with each other, and I think that's one of the tricky parts of differentiation, is actually to understand the students, understand how they learn and what's their learning pace, and find these instruments. And that's why I mentioned time, because it does take time. It does take time to get to know your students, and it does take time to understand what is how they can achieve their best. And one of probably my last points,
finally, if you can, yes,
yeah, is that inclusive education is a team effort. I think it involves parents, teachers, school leadership, and professionals, just to make sure that the environment is inclusive. For example, in our school, we have well-being team, and we have inclusion support workers. We have PSD coordinators and aides for funded students. We have multicultural aides for students who don't speak English as an additional language. And we also have a team environment in our staff rooms and the way our school operates. And we also involve our parents, and it's detrimental to have these sort of connections for each student to experience success. And
we'll leave it there, and we can leave the rest of the discussion. It's you paint a brilliantly ideal situation, what you're describing there, Anna. It's lovely, but it loops us back, Mel, if I can, to really where we started, and one of your initial observations about the best system focuses on every child, and that seems to be pretty much exactly what Anna's describing there. When reeled out like that, as Anna does, it could maybe even sound overwhelmingly complex. Does it have to be?
Well, in some ways, of course, it is complex. And I mean, just to say congratulations to Anna and John for what they've told us. I mean, they brought the conversation to life, really, in terms of what we've talked about. I mean, here is clearly an school, and it's a large school that's driven by inclusion and equity, and is seeing teachers as having a key role. The investment in teachers. You see, if we look internationally, the best education systems are places where teachers are valued and supported. They may not necessarily be the highest paid people in their society, but teaching is regarded as being important, and teachers are valued. And that value of teachers is there in everything that Anna and John have talked about. It's an investment in the learning of adults, in the belief that that will pay off in the learning of children. And it seems to me that that social process of learning, and when that moves forward and we start to go into those deeper cultural areas, of course, differences are reconstructed. Traditionally, when we have children who are different, we want them fixed. And if they can't be fixed, we want them taken away. What happens, I think, in schools like the one we talked about, gradually over time, people see that difference can be a resource, a stimulus to creativity and innovation. And it's that creativity and innovation, which, as Anna said, is driven by inquiry, teacher action research, if you like, which actually starts to develop the capacity of the school to reach out to all children. But as we keep saying, it takes time.
Kiki, I'd love to hear from you, given what you just heard from John and Anna in particular, such a child-based approach that must be resonating with you strongly.
Absolutely, some fantastic ideas. I mean, the idea of, can you hear me? Because yes, I know I was frozen. Yes. Yeah. The idea of circle time, you know, that's something that you embed this idea of allowing students to express themselves. I was surprised to hear that some of the students in your school, John, they were saying everything is great, even though it can go both ways. So I'm not surprised by some students saying that, but in a school where you embed such approaches, such as Anna's, students are becoming much more confident to be much more honest. But you reminded me, John, of me interviewing some students here in England, and they were saying to me how they felt the lesson was going too fast for them. And I said, have you ever raised this?
It's an unstable connection that we have there with Kiki this evening, which is a really great shame. She'll be back with us in a moment. We'll try and pick her up. John, did you want to just pick up the point that that Kiki was raising there? I don't know if she got through enough of it for you to hook into it.
No, that's fine. Just from our point, we had what they call an aha moment with Student Voice about 2 years ago, where we sat down and interviewed a lot of the Year 12s, and it was the same. I think this is where Kiki was going, is that a lot of students had genuine concerns about the way that the classes were affecting their ability to learn, but generally they were too nice to say anything about it, because they saw that would be teachers getting criticism from the students, and that would hurt their feelings, and that's what they didn't want to do.
I think we've got Kiki on just taking you off video to see if that improves your audio. You there, Kiki?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can. Did you hear John's response to what you were saying there?
I did, and I totally agree with that. But I also wanted to say, from my experience working with a number of schools, that we also have the opposite dimension, that sometimes students are very critical, especially in primary schools, that they are much more open to say what they're thinking. So we had to do a lot of work to go back to John's point that he made earlier about how to have constructive dialogues. So for us, the approaches that we're using is not about evaluating teachers, is not about saying this was a good lesson or a bad lesson. It's about reflecting about what happens in the classes and about having dialogues and making things better together, that togetherness that Anna spoke about. So fantastic for me to hear what the school is doing, both from Anna and from John. And these resonate very much with the approaches that I'm using with schools here as well.
That's great to hear. I want to go to Chris now as well, because as someone who's worked as a consultant and come in and out of various educational settings, Chris, you must have some reflections on this as well.
Yeah, I'd like to say it's been great listening to John and Anna talk about their school. And I think what's highlighted here is that we can go and tell people all these ideas and these wonderful things that you can do and explain what inclusion is. And you can develop great policies, but it needs the school to take it on board and look at how it's going to work in their own cultural context. And I think that came through so clearly with John and Anna's discussion there. Certainly something that Mel's been raising since the beginning. Where we go out and we work with different schools, different systems, different cultures, There is no one answer for everyone, and you have to work with them so that they come up with what will best meet their needs. There's a big tendency for this one size fits all, and it doesn't. Inclusion is one of the most diverse approaches to education that we've ever had.
Well, you've anticipated a really good question that's come from our streamers today. So let's move on to that now. And it comes from Happy Bat 1977, which is just a great handle anyway, and I wanted to say it out loud. Interesting to think about who defines inclusion. Does it happen on a school level, a national level, an international level? Should my inclusion in my classroom look like yours? Umesh, can I ask you to respond to that initially? Is inclusion something that can be relative, defined, redefined, and even fit for purpose? Or is it an immutable concept?
I think inclusion is, for me, it's a philosophy. I mean, if you talk about inclusion, it's the idea that you accept me as I am, and you are ready to change the practices in your system. So that, you know, what, if you talk about inclusion is all, if you think about any classroom you go to, there are no two students who are similar. All kids are different. So inclusion means appreciating and acknowledging that all kids are different and we can learn from each other. And as Mel talked about, it allows you to be more innovative, and the diversity in your classroom is the strength. And if you start using your diversity in your classroom, it can make you a better teacher. And I think if you start with this idea, you can design policies. So, you know, bottom-up approach where you start talking about what it looks like in the classroom. So rather than policymakers telling you what inclusion should look like, it should be the students should be telling us what it should look like. Teachers should be telling us what it should like, and the leader should be coming in this journey together. So bringing those two parties together, that's how we should be defining. But what I also want to talk about, you know, as we go around different countries, people think that, you know, is this inclusion is defined in America or say Australia? Should we be adopting those definitions? I have to say, actually, you should be thinking about your own definitions in your own countries, in your own context, and actually bringing those people from your own context to redefine inclusion might be a better idea, rather than taking an idea coming from another countries or another context.
Well, that's what the question goes to. Who defines inclusion? And it immediately asks us to reflect on, you know, on the hierarchy of decision making, on, you know, who makes that decision on high. Is there anything that you want to split in there, Mel, or anyone else? So, and remember, wake your hand up if you're dying to come in. Take yourselves off mute. Try not to rattle too much, and jump in if you need to. Mel, do you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really useful debate we've already had about these very elusive concepts really need to be debated, and the meaning of them evolve in particular places. And it is useful to look at documents from elsewhere. I mean, there's been a lot of documents in the last 2 or 3 years from UNESCO which offer working definitions, but they don't give you the answer. They really invite a conversation. And as John has emphasized, it's that process of socially constructing those definitions, which gradually bring people together. I mean, when I'm working,
those definitions very different, Mel? Are they really varied?
No. I think in the sort of international policy documents that there is a consensus emerging, really around the Education 2030 movement, which is what's guiding international debates. Really, in the work I do with schools, a starting point for the discussion, I sometimes say, is I think what we're talking about here is increasing the presence, the participation and achievement of all children. So you start at the beginning, presence, who is here, who is attending, right? You need evidence about all of that, but presence is insufficient because you can be here and attending and actually not taking part. So the next stage is participation. Who is participating? Whose voice is heard? Who is contributing? Who feels valued in the school? But I'm arguing even that's insufficient because you've been present and participating and you might not be learning anything that's useful to you. So ultimately, inclusion, the nirvana of it, if you will, is achievement. It's about what governments are talking about when they say we want to raise standards. I'm happy to agree with that, except go back to it, school improvement with attitude, raising standards for all children, not only for some children. So when I'm working in schools, I say, this doesn't tell you the answer, but it invites you to have that discussion that John and Anna have been talking about.
John, you were frantically writing notes there. Anything you want to add? And then I'll come to you, Umesh.
Look, I think that idea of it having to be a discussion that happens over and over again is really important, because the cohort of students changes with time. And what might have been your ideas and what sort of developed your definition, your policies and your processes for one group of students. 10 years later, or even not even that long, 5 years later, the cohort of students could be quite different. And so you need to revisit that argument to refocus your idea of inclusiveness.
Kiki, I'll come to you, Umesh, but I'm mindful that Kiki's off video and I don't want her to be forgotten in this conversation. Kiki, anything you want to add in there? Don't forget to turn yourself off mute. No? We may have an issue there with Kiki, so we'll see if we can get it back on. Umesh?
I love the idea that Mel was talking about. It's, he talks about attending schools and participating, then acceptance and achievement. I just want to add two other things to this definition that I think might make it more holistic. It's the happiness of those students and belongingness, because we forget we can do all the logistical things around inclusion, but students may not have sense of belongingness, or they don't feel happy going to those classrooms or those schools. And that makes the whole picture for a student, whether you could be anywhere in the world. And I think if you can do for those 6 things or 5 things for our students, we can say that we have done a great job of making our societies and classrooms inclusive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's exactly what you were talking to there, Anna, and everything that you were saying was about, I think the very first thing that you said in your presentation was that the child feels like they belong.
Definitely. And I think it's very important to have, for the students to feel comfortable and welcome in their classrooms. And I think it's just one of the things that, and talking about the definition of inclusion, I think yet, of course, there is a common definition from like as a policy, but I think each teacher creates their own definition of inclusion. It might be slightly different, it might depend on their classes, but they are entitled to like have their ideal classroom, and I think in their ideal classroom, inclusion definitely would be one of the main points.
Kiki, are you there now? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Is there anything you've heard that you'd like to contribute to?
No, that's fine. I think everybody covered the main issues about the definitions and this challenge of coming up with one definition.
Well, we've got, I'll come to you in a second, Mel. We've just got a question here that I'd like to get to, and it gets us down to some fundamentals and some nitty-gritty, really, of the challenge of this. And this is our question from Tamara. Can total inclusion work with violent students? Who would like to start there?
Well, I can start. I know that challenging behaviors is one of the main issues in the teaching profession, and I had a number of students with violent behaviors, and it is a long journey. And as I said, it is a team effort, so it needs to be you need to have support of parents and like well-being teams, external providers, psychologists. But it is possible. But as I said, it is a long journey, but you need to be committed. And and you also need to find but also student also needs to be committed to this journey. I think it needs to be it cannot be one-way street, but I think with consistency and just with showing that you care, that is it is possible to change these violent behaviors.
Kiki, do you have anything to add there?
Yes, I wanted to add, because I've heard this question many times from my own students at the university, and I always direct people back to something I've read in 1919 from American authors Steinbach and Steinbach, who were saying that the only question we should be asking is, how can we include a particular child in school, as opposed to should we be including this child? So it is about this challenging process of finding ways together of how to make sure and making modifications within the context in order to allow that student to be included. So that's the only question that we should be asking from my point of view, though it is challenging.
Umesh?
I just want to add, some great ideas. if you think about, when we start talking about students who's displaying highly challenging behavior, what we need to start asking is, what are we doing for students who are not displaying challenging behavior? Because we need to start preventing challenging behavior in our schools. So schools that do inclusion, that they implement inclusive practices really well, what they do is they implement practices to prevent any challenging behaviors, and then they celebrate when students are behaving very well. When you start doing those things in your school, you will find there are not many students who are displaying challenging behavior. The problem is when we start focusing too much on that particular student, and then the rest of the students are not misbehaving. That's not the case. Actually, when you go to any school, there are kids misbehave at different times. What we need to do is we need to say, what are we doing for students when they don't misbehave? How are we celebrating students behaving really well? And then you start talking about what we do need to do about students, like, when they display challenging behavior.
One of the most interesting things that I've learned just in my life as a journalist and speaking to educators, and also as a parent of a child, is that it was a very interesting observation made by a teacher who had a number of kids on the autism spectrum in her class. And she said she'd realised over time that the best way to teach an autistic child was actually the best way to teach any child. Because it was explicit learning, it was visual learning, it was in a low stimulation environment, it was in a comfortable place physically, it was in a place where they could actually move or could exercise and could, keep their mind-body connection very strong. And it was sort of like a perfect lesson in inclusivity. And again, it hooks us right back around, Mel, to your original observation about it's a way to excellence for everyone, is actually this inclusive approach to education. Can you talk to us? I don't just want to stick with an example of a child with autism or an autistic child, but John, I'll come to you as well. But Mel, anything you want to reflect on there? Because I thought that was sort of the most wonderful, explicit example of what we mean by excellence and inclusion being linked.
Yeah, and I think that conversation about the sort of challenging behaviour reminds us that this is not just about what happens in classrooms and schools. And I think when we talk about moving the system forward, and a lot of my work these days is about system movement. Of course, it's first and foremost about what teachers do in classrooms and what schools do to create the climate of learning that helps teachers. But then we've got to go beyond the school gate, right? Because children only spend part of the time in the school. One first thing to say is that my experience of system change, one of the things that schools do is they collaborate with other schools. So if it's a secondary school, it collaborates with primary schools. If it's a school in a district, it collaborates with other schools in a district. And where there are special schools, they're part of that collaboration. And I think that idea of kind of moving knowledge around within a school can be extended to other schools. But then the big issue, which we mustn't not deal with 10 minutes to go, is the role of the wider community and the families. That schools that make progress, they see families as a resource. They know their children better than we do anyway, and they make parents generally feel that they are partners in the process. But then there's so many other players, the local community, faith groups, businesses, universities. The potential is enormous. And somehow we have to create a framework where there is this kind of collective work going on. And of course, that adds further pressure to those who are leading schools, because I'm asking them really not only to think about their own schools, but to think about other schools and to work with the wider community.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. And I had a question here about families. We'll get to that in a moment. But what you're talking there about the village, Mel, that really has to be engaged in order to raise these children. You wanted to say something, John?
Just briefly. The question about can you truly include a violent child, I think you have to go back to the reasons why, because there are very different reasons why a child is violent. It could be through autism or some other conditions like that, or it can be simply the upbringing of the child and they've lived in a violent and abusive household. Now, to try and deal with the students the same way it gets back to whoever said it before, knowing there's reasons why the student is displaying the behaviour they are. And what you have to do is to address the behaviour, not the child. if you get what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything you wanted to jump in here with, Chris? And we will talk about families. And I'm interested that Mel has mentioned them in terms of an incredibly valuable resource, and also the connective tissue, if you like, from the child to the school. I'm also mindful, though, in some schools, and I've had experience of them here in Melbourne, that they can often be the obstacles to genuine inclusion in a school as well. Could I ask you to reflect on that?
Yeah, I think you've raised something which is very important, and it's something we haven't yet touched on really. And this is the involvement of parents in decision making in schools. Some schools are very open and very willing to involve their parents. And certainly nowadays, there's much more expectation that a parent should be part of developing an individual educational plan for a child, or an individual behavioural plan if the child has severe behaviour. And I think this is absolutely critical, because as Mel said, they only spend part of their day in school. The rest of the time they're at home. And if you don't get consistency what the parents are doing and what the teachers are doing, it makes it very much harder to actually cater for the individual child's needs. I think what's coming out of all this conversation, and it keeps coming back to, you've got to look at the school, you've got to look at the culture in the school, but it's got to be focused on the individual child. There is no one overall decision that you can make for everyone. You've got to come back to the individuals. That's what Anna was saying, that developing a rapport with them, an understanding of them, and working more closely with the parents. Now, traditionally, some parents have been a little, we could say, challenging when it comes to their child and very demanding, but that's usually because the school's not taken on board an opportunity to meet with them, to talk with them, and to appreciate, which someone just said a moment ago, that the parents know the child much more than we do as teachers. And I think this openness with listening to the students themselves through Kiki's research is fantastic. Anna through developing the rapport, and John through getting the families involved, is certainly one of the ways forward to improving equity if we really do want to cater for the individual students' needs and excellence in teaching and learning.
We need to start to wrap up, so I did want to get some final observations from you all before we do that. Kiki, can I start with you, just reflecting on the discussion we've had, and perhaps any final thoughts you'd like to leave people with today?
Just to follow up from what Chris was saying there about the families, and the way that if we see children as the problem that need to be fixed, the same could apply for parents and families as well. So my observation is that goes back to school leadership, and those schools that manage to get the family on board are those that make them feel valued and that they have something to contribute. So just as a final say, I think we're all in agreement here. It's been a fantastic panel, that we are very committed to making this happen and promoting inclusive schools, but we all have to come together and make sure that we value one another's contribution and have this commitment going on throughout school life.
Kiki, thank you. Anna, anything you just like to finally observe?
Yep, just a final observation. I think that's quite important, is just to acknowledge the positive behaviors and changes. And I think it's very important in inclusion, just to build that positive rapport with students, families, and wider community. I think it's one of the key success criteria to achieve inclusion.
John Baston?
Just writing something down here. I think, to me, it's about making sure the students know how to have a voice in the school. It's about making sure the teachers know how to listen. And it's about making sure that they work together to improve the learning outcomes for the students.
Umesh?
I think for me, the most important thing is relationships that you build with parents, with teachers, with everyone in the school. And I think the second most important thing, if you really want to teach, you have students you don't know how to do, and you don't have any textbooks. I think one of the best thing you can do is talk to the student, because many a time they will give you tips how to teach him or her. Yes. And if we use those, you can be anywhere in the world. You can teach all kids anywhere in the world. That's what I think is important.
Great observation. Chris?
Yes, I'd like to just conclude by saying that internationally, almost all systems have now invested considerable money and resources into developing inclusive education policies. But the converse is that you don't see that same amount of investment in teacher preparation and in supporting teachers. And I think if we really want to become more inclusive, we've got to stand up and really invest much more in our teachers, who are the ones who are having to implement these policies.
And Mel.
Well, first of all, just to congratulate everybody on, and it's a very good conversation. I've learned a lot this morning and feel quite a lot of inspiration from what we've heard. In the school improvement world, which I belong to, because this is about school improvement with attitude, as I said earlier, it's often said that school improvement is technically simple, but socially complex. It's not that difficult, given the expertise we have here, for example, to define what needs to happen. That's not the difficult bit. The difficult bit is getting everybody to pull in the same direction, especially teachers, because they are very busy. They don't have a lot of time. The life of the teacher is very intensive, really. So it is socially complex, and we've got to bring people together. And I think, as I said right at the beginning, the most important thing is the collective will to make it happen.
It's a wonderful note on which to finish, and I agree. It's been a terrific conversation. I'll ask you to thank our panelists, Anna Laktianova, John Baston, Kiki Meshu, Mel Ainsko, Umesh Sharma, and Chris Forlan. Thank you all. It's been really great to have you and to have you contributing. And to all of your questions, I'm sorry I didn't get to too many of them, but all of them are great. I think we'll find some way of compiling those questions maybe and distributing them after this altogether. Please, thank you for coming along this evening.